Well, good afternoon, my friends, and welcome back to my channel again. Another year is upon us, and my intent was to do something different this year. However, if it's anything like the past decade, I will probably continue to be consistently inconsistent in the sense that I usually have an idea at the beginning of the year of a direction I want to take my channel, and I end up just doing what I always do, talking to the camera. And that's okay. I've learned to accept that's just the person I am, and that's what I find the most interesting myself is discussing topics where I might not have the full picture or haven't quite looked into it enough. Things that are interesting and amazing to me. But there is one area of discussion that I tend to focus on my channel, and that's self-betterment. Now, I do this through many different methods. I don't necessarily make these, spontaneous self-help videos where I say, you can do it. All you got to do is just get up and force yourself. And this is how you conquer fear. And this is how you conquer depression. And I have heard enough of these, kind of pop psychology, inspirational speakers to know that the older you get, the more you realize that these things are very difficult to continue long term. Anyone can sit in their car and just think positive when they're traveling and sit in the slow lane and not stress about traffic and learn how to control their emotions. But without going too far here, my point here is that I'm going to be doing a series, an emotional intelligence series. And it may sound, I guess, maybe arrogant or egotistical to assume, at least to me, assuming that I can tell anyone else how to stress less or be happier or enjoy their life more. I have my own problems. But that's exactly why the reason why we need people to be honest about their own lives, all of us, with each other. So we realize that this image, this illusion we have of certain types of people just being happy all the time is just that, an illusion. So with this first episode of Emotional Intelligence, I would like to discuss fear. Fear is something that we've carried from our ancestors into the modern day. It helped us survive. There's a term called pareidolia, and also apophenia. These are two similar conditions where you either see faces in the clouds, that can be things like that, or you see human faces anyway, because that helped us survive, or even animal faces. You've probably all heard the stories about how it's better to see a tiger that's not there and to run from it or to hide from it than it is to just assume that it's not there. It's the reason why when you see a rope across the road, you think snake. These are primal, instant, they're learned, but they're also carried on from our very primal time. There are still places where they worry about poisonous snakes. Fortunately, not here. But unless I'm out east and there's rattlesnakes, of course. But the point here is that fear does help us survive. It does carry some benefit to it. But the fight or flight that we face, generally that was utilized in the past to help us escape danger, is now, I believe, misdirected onto each other. A fear and a suspicion of other people, a fear and a suspicion of anybody who's in this group or that group, or people who are rich, or a suspicion of people who are poor, or a different color, race, gender, whatever it might be. People generally, once you get to know a person, all of that drops away. But when we can sit and generalize and stereotype entire groups, it makes it easier. And that ultimately, when we recognize that that's fear-based, that comes from fear, that's where xenophobia arrives from. But it's not just fear of people or a type of person. It's fear of the outcome of what that group of people or that person might bring upon us in our lives. For example, as far as emotions go, a lot of people would say, don't be angry, Learn to get rid of your anger and let it go. I've tried that in the past. I don't harbor anger. I have learned over my life to just let things go. But I also recognize that it's okay to get angry. If you beat yourself up because you feel it in your stomach when somebody wrongs you, don't worry about that. That's just part of survival, but that's also part of our intuition telling us when somebody's trying to bullshit us or not, or when somebody's trying to wrong us or not. Anger is a way for us to get that rush to express ourselves, but then to let it go and move past it. Sadness, for example, or Even jealousy or envy. These are things, traits that people would want to claim to want to get rid of as well, but in fact, it tells us what we really want. Being envious of other people or seeing something and saying, I wish I had that, that helps to motivate you to get that thing. But fear stands alone as a more or less useless, not just useless, but way overused emotion. And I think that the most complicated part about it is that we don't always know exactly what we fear. And of all the, you know, everything that I've studied about human nature, psychology, I actually put down a psychology textbook like halfway through. Many years ago, like a decade ago, I was reading it and I wanted to know as much as I could about personality types and all the different supposed personality types, INFJ or whatever. Then on the other scales, the different people who believe that people can really be categorized into groups. The more you look into it, the more you find it's just bullshit. And then you find out that, of course, people are naturally all different, but there will be certain types of people. I'm not doubting that if you push a certain type of person's buttons a certain way, they'll respond a certain way. But often this is learned, and this can be unlearned. People are types of people because of what we've learned. But at any rate, some people tend to have different chemistry to the degree where they can be more fearful. We don't know if that's something that maybe is genetic or if that's something that they've learned. But either way, it's the number one thing that we can do to improve our lives is to stop worrying. And say there's two sides, a circle of influence and a circle of concern. The circle of influence are things you can actually change. Let's say you're fearful that you're going to go broke. Well, that's in your circle of control a lot of the time, or your circle of influence. But the other one's your circle of concern, not control, but concern. There's concern and influence. Concern is like, I'm worried about some shadowy cabal creating a new world order. Well, that's a pointless worry. It's something you can be aware of or something you can believe in. But if it's something that consumes your time or actually gets you angry or fearful, then it has no purpose because it's not something that you can actually deal with. This is why think locally, or rather think globally, act locally is such an appropriate saying for so many situations. We need to take care of our own communities before we worry about what the nation's doing. But we also need to take care of our own lives before we worry about what the community is doing. Everybody knows that one person who's on Next Door Neighbor, that app for neighbors. The one person who's always on there complaining about these kids making noise, or I saw a suspicious character. The blind speakers that are always worried about what's going on in the neighborhood. Often you find out that these are the kind of people who really don't have any real control in their own lives. They're bored. They have nothing else to do. To make the point better, some of the people who act the most fearful are the people that have the least to fear. And that's why it's kind of pathetic. In fact, something I've noticed over all the years of watching interviews with people in other countries, war-torn regions, areas where they've been bombarded consistently, or where they suffer disease and famine, viruses, bacterial infections, whatever it might be. An outbreak of something in one area might just be like, devastating to people, but hi, Lucy. Lucy wants to say hi. Hi, baby. Hi. Say hi. But in another region, that might not even faze them. It might not. They're like, you'll see a person who has suffered their entire life with their towns being bombed, and they become outspoken, they become politicians, or they start these mass movements or groups to improve lives for others. Instead of complaining, instead of taking victim status, you hear it in their voices that that's what inspired me. That fear helped to inspire me to be a better person, to want to help others not to face that. But in Western society today, we're so shut out from one another that instead of helping our neighbors, unless there's a major disaster that's local, we just want to find some fault in their way of thinking or pointing the finger. And ultimately, I think this comes down to our own fear of, at the very, very root of it, and I I don't want to bring it to this main point as saying the only reason we fear is because of B. We fear pain, and that's ultimately a fear of death. Death is kind of the discussion people don't want to have, but I believe it is the most crucial thing to embrace. To read all the philosophies about death and dying. We can assume whatever we want, we can have faith if we want, but honestly, to be honest with ourselves, to say, hey, one day, who I am now will not exist in this world. So what am I going to do about it? Am I going to worry about it? Of course not. There's always going to be that inkling in the back of our minds that says, oh man, I could get hurt doing this, or I could die doing this. But ultimately, the more we face, the more adversity we face, the less it seems to matter. You'll notice that the people who are faced with the most challenges and the most near-death issues, they don't go on to be the people who bubble wrap themselves and hide away. They're the people who go out and say, screw it, I might as well just live this life to its fullest because I know how precious it really is. So the more that we are pushed down into these simple boxes, living our lives, everything's easy, maybe not easy. The problem is that the mental anguish that we get from just day-to-day life, when we don't feel like we're participating or that the world's going the direction we want, that's where a lot of the fear comes from. And I heard about this term the other day called climate anxiety. I laughed. I thought, really? I mean, they have entire shows about this, climate anxiety, but when I thought about it, I realized, wow, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Because they're constantly pushing, we've got 10 years and the whole freaking nature's going to implode. Look, I'm an environmentalist. I am all for protecting forests, all for protecting especially the oceans, which produce 80% of the oxygen. But that's for another discussion. We like the pretty animals and the pretty forests. We don't really understand the science of how the Earth works. And so we want to assume that humans are going to destroy the planet in 10 years and everything's going to be doomed. This causes people anxiety. But the thing is, the reason why it's an issue is because people can't do anything about it. You can't just tell people to stop driving cars when that's the only car they can afford. You can't just tell people to use less air conditioning when they're freaking roasting. The world that we live in is the world that we live in. And we can do our best as individuals to try to, not contribute to climate change. But really to have anxiety about that, to me, is preposterous. I mean, even living next to a facility where there's dangerous chemicals being made, there's a risk. But if you have an actual physical fear, what you're doing is, fear doesn't change anything. Concern and awareness and research, you can make decisions to help you. But just being fearful and putting your hands up, like a lot of people do, and like we've done, say, in this pandemic, it's really amazing how quickly people can fall into a kind of a mass psychosis and an individual psychosis. The last year or so, I've seen so much fear, it's ludicrous. I mean, not just over what's going on with the pandemic, but what's going on worldwide with various technological woes and wars and economic fallouts. We're in an interesting time right now, people, and we will definitely pull through. In the sense of pulling through means that our society will continue to function in some way or another. It might look totally different, but it's not like everything's going to implode tomorrow. But unless there's a major CME or solar flare, which is likely to happen in the next couple decades. And the irony of that is that it's the last thing we ever prepare for or care about. And it's the one thing that would take us back to, not the Stone Age, as people say, but it would definitely set society back. Because it's not about taking, say, down the grid itself and losing all our power. It's the aftermath that follows, when all the freezers and everything melts and people are out getting food and they start to see in each other things that they didn't realize could happen. Because they're not prepared for it. Because we've lived so sheltered in this nation, in the U.S., for so long that we don't know any real, adversity. And when it comes to our doorstep, we won't be prepared to face it like other communities do in other places. No matter what happens in the world, whether it's wars or pestilence, there will still be tribes and communities and groups of people who are very slightly affected by it. And that's part of the reason why I want to move out and get my own land. It's not that I don't like people. It's just that when you depend on a group of people and a town, a society, a city life, whatever it might be, then you're wrapped up in all the problems that happen there, and everyone else's fears start to rub off on you. So that's my episode 1. I don't want to go on for 25 minutes like I usually do. I'm going to try to keep these around 15. But honestly, when it comes to dealing with emotions, all of them come and go. But fear is something we really have to nip in the bud. I had anxiety in my early to mid 30s. It was bad, and I realized it was self-made. I, at the time, was on probation for some mushrooms. And for that couple of years, I was always worried about whether I was going to get called in for a drug test or something like that. But that really, it just opened up other anxieties that I had. And I realized I'm going to have to learn to deal with this. And I learned to take life for what it is. Deep breathing. Don't let stress consume you. And here's the thing. It's very hard to identify, because these frustrations can lay just under the surface of your day-to-day smile and bullshit. I'll see people who are just seem totally fine, and then they just snap on one thing. It's like that's just been brewing in the back of their minds. They might not even realize it. Being aware of this is extremely important, because we all do it to a degree. The more likely we are to snap or be easily triggered to where we actually feel anger or fear is the more we need to learn to deal with it. So be well, my friends. Until next episode, I appreciate you all. I'm sorry that my videos aren't all professionally made with jump cuts and leaving no empty space, but I really feel like the old long format discussion is going by the wayside. There's no pauses. Everything is just so cultured to a specific mentality these days that it's just a weird time. Just a weird time. And it's always a weird time. I know a lot of people have had a lot of issues in the last couple of years, and we can all pull through. Peace and love. Talk to you next time. Be well.